have a joint bank account because they're solo, even if they're living with someone. She also then went on to say, well, you know, if they're having problems, they should get counselling, and if things are really bad, they should leave. This shows a really deep and sensitive understanding of the situation in which such women find themselves. And it's not an option. It's not the way to approach these things, and the government should change that. There are a number of other elements that I won't go into in great detail. The digital by default system, I believe, is not working anywhere near as smoothly as the government says. The figures in terms of the number of people who begin a claims process and then abandon it are remarkably high. Close to a third of people give up. Now, I suspect that DWP is quite happy about that in a way. Good, less benefits to be paid. But again, a huge level of frustration and not reflected in the statistics. I think they've overstated the number of people who are comfortable doing all this digitally. And I think the system is, despite their suggestions that there are all sorts of other alternatives, I think it is overwhelmingly pressing people to do everything online. The sanctions I've already talked about. The consequences for those who are sanctioned are grim. I've got a long section in my report about digital and automation policies in the welfare area. The United Kingdom sees itself as being at the forefront in world terms in this area, and in some ways it is. But I've also got a number of warnings in here saying that this automation can very quickly cross over into a line where all sorts of compassion, all sorts of human interaction and so on are lost, and that a welfare system cannot survive on algorithms alone. The rest of my report, which I'll deal with very quickly because I want to take questions, focuses in particular on what I call the dismantling of the broader social safety net. So it's not just universal credit. It's a big mistake to focus only on that, although, of course, there is immense dislike for the system out there. The benefit reductions are pretty draconian. There is an extraordinary disconnect between the triple block that protects pensioners and the freeze that freezes all in-work beneficiaries. The argument that pensioners couldn't possibly have to put up with that, quite right. Whereas people in work, well, let them suffer, let them lose every year, let them get less. I think that's deeply problematic. One of the things that I probably feel most strongly about, and I think I'll finish on this note, is actually the cuts in local authority budgets. Britain has famously had a culture of local concern, of people being able to get some sort of assistance from their local council, some sort of human contact. When things go really wrong, there'll be a social worker, there'll be some service they can go to. 49.9% cuts according to the National Audit Office. And so I meet the leader of the council in Newcastle and he tells me, we've been reduced to emergency service provision. We're not doing all of the range of things that we think are really essential for our community and that we want to do. We don't have the money. When I meet the economic assistant to the Treasury, no, it's fine. These councils have got a lot of money. They can take these cuts. They're doing well. It's a totally mechanical economic analysis that ignores the damage that I think is being done to the fabric of British society, to the sense of community, which has been built in part around the sports centres, the recreation places, the public lands that are being sold off, the libraries that are being closed down, the youth centres that are being downsized, and soon there will be nowhere for people in the lower income groups to go. It's perfect because those higher income groups will have more money because their taxes are being cut. but they will find themselves living in an increasingly hostile and unwelcoming society because the community roots are being systematically broken. So I think there are big reasons for concern. I'll end by saying that I think if a new minister was interested, if a new government was interested, the harshness, the worst aspects of a lot of these policies could be changed overnight and for very little money. I'll leave it at that. I'm happy to take questions.
So we will be taking questions and there will be a roving mic. Have we got a we have a roving mic. So if you could just wait until the mic comes to you and announce your name and which organisation you're working for. Because we're streaming this conference and we won't be able to hear you until you've got the mic. So shall we start over there? The lady over there, Junko, thank you very much.
Jackie Long from Channel 4 News. You talk about ministers being in a state of denial. Do you think they don't see the poverty and the problems that you describe? Or do you think they choose to ignore them?
I think they have an overriding set of objectives, which are to cut the welfare system, cut what they see as dependency, cut expenditures, and they're looking at that sort of bottom line. I cannot believe that they are as happy with the system as they assured me they were. I must have met with 40 members of parliament from all parties, and they said, almost as one, they said, we spend all of our damn time in the constituency office dealing with these welfare issues. It's so frustrating, it's so unnecessary, and they won't listen to us. I think ministers must be getting that message, but they're not heeding it.
Thank you, Professor Olson. Dragan Nastic from UNICEF UK. For the United Nations Children's Fund, child poverty, of course, is a major human rights issue. In 2016, the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child expressed its serious concern with the level of child poverty in the UK, impact of austerity, and lack of any action plan, plus removal of targets and child poverty measures. I wanted to ask you whether during your fact-finding mission you had a chance to meet with children, hear from them about their experiences of living in coping with poverty. And also, have you maybe heard some differences in the approach throughout the UK? I'm specifically referring to devolved administrations when it comes to child poverty and human rights-based approach. Thank you.
I was very fortunate to meet with quite a few children in my time here. I met with primary school children, often children of immigrants or children living in very poor, notoriously poor areas. I met with youth from inner city London areas and spoke with them at length about their particular concerns about how the closure of a youth community centre affects them, how they live in such terrible housing conditions that they can't stay at home. They've got to get out. But if they get out, they can go to a youth centre, and that's great. If they can't go to a youth centre, they're on the streets. On the streets, there are gangs, there are drugs, there are bad things, and that's where one goes. So it makes a huge difference to them if there are services provided or not. In terms of the devolved administrations, I think one of the things that surprised me most is to hear from the officials in Northern Ireland and from the First Minister and the Finance Secretary and others in Scotland how much time they spent trying to counteract the UK welfare policy. They've got what they call mitigation policies. £125 million a year spent in each of those places trying to make up for the worst, the harshest aspects of the policies being pushed very hard by central government. That seems to me to be shocking. There's got to be a lesson to be learned there. This is not simply a matter of politics. It's a matter of the reaction of people and it's entirely consistent with what I heard in England. The difference is that in the devolved areas they're trying to do something about it, but in England they're not.
Sophie Airy from the British Medical Journal. I wanted to just ask what you've observed and whether you've drawn any conclusions about the impact of the policies you've been talking about on people's health.
I deliberately didn't try to get a deep understanding of the NHS and related developments. I think the area that I picked up on most is probably the area of mental health. And again, I was surprised at all of the talk of suicide, both the people I met who told me that they had contemplated suicide, the charities who told me that there was a huge upswing in the number of people getting counselling and so on, the fact that the government felt it necessary to appoint a minister for suicide prevention. Alongside that is the focus on loneliness. Sort of seems like an odd issue for government to have to look at, but of course as I discovered more about the local authority cuts and other developments, I can see that's what loneliness is about. Old people, people who don't have relatives around the place, are increasingly lonely as community facilities disappear, and particularly as the benefits that are available to them shrink increasingly and they can't even afford a bus fare or whatever else it takes to get out and meet people. Combined with that, I guess I've already mentioned the extent to which people feel intimidated by, fearful of the universal credit and related interactions that they have. So I think that there are pretty serious mental health dimensions to the poverty challenges that I've seen here.
Hi, Steve Walker from the Squawk Box. You mentioned that you thought that most of these problems could be solved overnight with very little cost. I mean, what kind of measures are you thinking of? And if it's that simple, are there kind of human rights breach aspects to the fact that the government isn't doing them?
I think the 5 to 12 week gap could be resolved overnight. I think that is a one-off issue. I mean, they're trying to push back payments and so on, but simply bringing them forward is not going, on a one-time basis, is not going to cost a lot of money. I think the single payment to a household, they say that there are significant computerization costs. I'd like to see those costings. I don't accept that a system which has had vast amounts of money poured into it would not be capable of being adjusted to do that. I think the two-child policy has, I'm just not sure how to put this because I don't want it to go in the wrong direction, but China's one-child policy, yes, it was forced, it was physical, but this is in the same ballpark, that poor people mustn't have more than 2 children. And if they do, the rest of the children are going to suffer. It's great. It's a really perfect way to punish families for families that had 4 children a few years ago suddenly have gone into a hole and only 2 children are going to be covered. So I think there are, the sanctions policy, it's been put to me that it's cruel and inhuman. It's very hard to disagree with that sort of assessment. And so, yes, I think we could analyse a lot of these policies in terms of their inconsistency with Britain's basic human rights obligations.
Hi, I'm Maeve McClenaghan from the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. We've been doing a project logging homeless deaths across the country because there was no centralised system doing that. I wonder if there's other areas where you've seen gaps in data or evidence and whether that's a kind of intentional failing from the government in not wanting to know the true scale of some of these issues.
I have to admit to being a little surprised at the extent to which the British government is reticent, if I can use that word, about collecting detailed statistics about the social condition of the country. So it's not just homelessness and related issues, but on food insecurity, for example, there is no official data